Okay, we're going to do Modern World History 2.3, and we're going to be explaining the competition between European kingdoms for space and resources. And I think space and resources are key here, seeing as we just did Modern World History 1.5 on banking, and we were looking at the commercial revolution. So I kind of want to relate this standard naturally to money. That's what it's going to be about. We're going to talk about the 100 Years' War, okay, with France and England, and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire here in Central Europe, and then the response to Islam in the Iberian Peninsula. Related to this, I think it all comes back to money and economics. So let's first look at this map. You're familiar with this map. You can see the trade routes that existed and came about after the Crusades here in Europe, from town to town. Okay, and then naturally here in the Mediterranean Sea, the sea routes through Constantinople. Okay, and as trade expanded around Italy and then Greece here and stuff like that, and then of course trade routes that came here, England, modern day England, France, and then Spain and Portugal, and then back into the Mediterranean Sea there. So trade routes are going to be extremely important. Right. There's one more map I want to show you. All right, and this is a map related to some of the countries, okay, that would come to be during this time. All right, and we can see, we'll just here out of the way, we can see the England and France, because we talk about the 100 Years' War. Right, the connection between the Holy Roman Empire, and you see northern Italy there, the Papal States, the Catholic Church. All right, and then the Iberian Peninsula right here. Okay, Portugal, Spain, and then the Moors. Those are the Muslims, and we know they controlled here in southern Spain and what's going to happen there. So keep in mind, competition between European kingdoms, space, and resources. And there's some of the kingdoms, and then we looked at the other maps. So let's move on to the next slide and get further into this standard. This next slide, we're going to be looking at the 100 Years' War between France and England. Keep in mind, we're dealing with space and resources. So in the competition between these countries for that. So I want to keep that in mind. European kingdoms, space, and resources. So as we look here at the 100 Years' War, there's a couple things that come out of this. Looking first, okay, we see England and we see France. And then I want us to concentrate on geographically. Of course, we see right here the Holy Roman Empire, and here's the Iberian Peninsula, later to become the country of Spain, and then Portugal there, and we'll get to that in a minute. But we want to concentrate on this area here. Okay, this region here was made up of, you can see Burgundy, Flanders, Normandy, where the landings in World War II occurred. This area here is the area, the territory that's in dispute. Now, this is a story of love. Okay, how did it become a disputed area? Love. All right, King Edward II of England, all right, married the princess of France, and basically the marriage was to keep this territory together. Now, in keeping that territory together, as time went on, the queen, three of her brothers would actually rule France as the king, but they never had a male heir to take over. She, on the other hand, did have a son, and he would claim the crown. And that was in 1337. That's when the war would begin. So that's the story. We got a marriage of convenience to keep the territory together. Eventually, there's no male heir to take over as the King of France, and so the Queen of England, who was once French, her son claims the crown, and then that causes England and France to go, because you have the, keep in mind, you have the French nobility wanting to keep their territory. Now, a couple of important things that came out of this as France would win the war, with the help of Joan of Arc. She would help in attacking England and winning the war. She would wear kind of a knight's outfit and stuff like that as a woman, and interesting for that time, definitely. And she would help win the war. Tragically, she fell into English hands, and basically, she would be executed, burned at the stake type stuff. So, but a couple of things I want you to concentrate on here is the first one has to do with nationalism. Right, very important. Okay. Because the feelings of nationalism happened between England and France during this time, and the king was seen as the power of the French monarch, seen as the state. So we want to keep that in mind. Nationalism from this point on, as European, and keep in mind as we look at this, European kingdoms, okay, emerge. The peoples of those kingdoms are going to feel pride for their country. That is what nationalism is, and we'll go into that more. The king was seen as the leader of these countries. Also, the power of the French monarchy increased, and then England suffered internal turmoil, the War of the Roses. So I hope that explains it. The 100 Years' War, very briefly, and how it happened. So in the end, I have to take my love here and do my Ghostbusters, because love had little to do with it. It was, like I said, basically an alliance to keep the land, and that would falter. Okay, you can see the war ends in 1453. This picture here, I just circled crossbows because that became an important part of the or a weapon used during this time period. And we'll, as we look on in more world history standards, we'll see that weaponry becomes very important in the advancement of weaponry. So this is a good slide looking at geography, looking at politics, and the space and the competition for this space and the resources here. So we're going to end up with, like I said, modern day France, and then of course England, and the hatred between the two countries will last for hundreds of years. This next slide, we want to look at one of the innovations of the 100 Years' War, and that would be the use of the cannon. The cannon, or at least the early cannons that were used, were better at disturbing the horses than at hitting rapidly moving targets. But as they grew larger, they proved quite effective in blasting holes through the heavy walls of medieval castles and of towns. Now, this first use of such artillery against the French was in 1415 and gave the English an important victory. One other point that we must make here is you can't have the cannon without gunpowder. Okay. Now, gunpowder, when you research it, go back to China about the 9th century, making its way, as we know, through trade and everything else, these ideas, and then gunpowder came to Europe and was used during this time. By the end of the 100 Years' War, cannons were coming to their own as major forces on the battlefield, and artillery would progress from that point on and be used in all the wars that we have up to today. In this slide, we want to look at the rise of the the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe. Keep in mind we're looking at competition for these European kingdoms for space and resources. A couple of basic facts about how it began. All right, German King Otto I formed a close alliance with the Catholic Church, and he basically did this to hold down the nobles. We know the nobles lost power after the Crusades. The kings gained power, and this was another way to keep them down. Otto invaded Italy on the Pope's behalf. He was to stop an insurrection in 962, and the Pope would crown him the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, so it would form this, basically, this state here. Now, other rulers would come, and there's got the picture right there of King Otto I. Other rulers would come. Charles V would be one Holy Roman Emperor, and he would become kind of famous because he and his Christian allies eventually would stop the advance of the Ottomans, the Muslims, in Vienna, Austria in 1529. Although the Ottoman attacks would continue until 1697. Now the Ottomans are the Muslims. Okay, Charles's efforts to build the Holy Roman Empire as one of the largest and strongest states in Europe was ultimately a failure. Now, when we talk about competition between countries, that's what we want to get down to. We looked at the word earlier, nationalism, okay? All right. Francis I of France, who had lost the election to Charles to be the Holy Roman Emperor, openly supported the Muslim Turks, trying to weaken his rival. So here we see the Kingdom of France and Francis I actually supporting Muslims, okay, to weaken the Holy Roman Empire. So there we see competition between European kingdoms, and how important the fighting would become between these two states. Later, of course, the Reformation, Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther, would weaken the Holy Roman Empire, and we'll get to that at another time. But nationalism would become important here. So here's a rivalry: Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of France after the 100 Years' War, and the battle that would ensue there between these two European kingdoms. In this slide, we want to finish up with the response to Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, and talk about the Iberian Peninsula. We're looking right here at where Spain and Portugal, those countries would exist. A couple points I have down here. Islamic rule, all right, in the south from the F got cut off there. From the 8th to the 15th century, they were of course, we've already studied this, but the Muslims were able to cut across, of course, the Middle East, absolutely, and all of northern Africa, and then they were able to come here into southern Spain, and they were stopped by the Europeans at that point. Many of the ousted Gothic nobles took refuge in the unconquered northern Spanish highlands. And so when we see some of these colors here and different names, this is what we're talking about. They were able to take refuge there. From there, they aimed to reconquer their lands from the Moors, and that's what the Muslims were called. Okay, so let's keep that word in mind for a quiz. This war was the Reconquest, or is known as the Reconquista. Okay, the Muslim Tarifa kings competed in patronage of arts. Okay, the Way of the Saint James attracted pilgrims from all over Western Europe, and of course we know the Jewish population set the basics of Sephardic culture here in Spain. One other thing we learned earlier was that the classics from the Muslims were taken by a lot of these Jewish and European scholars in this area, and put in from Arabic into Latin, and then off into Europe, and then helped in the Renaissance. Okay, so when we talk about the Moors, we're basically looking at this group of men here. You can see the different dress they would have, the beards. You see the the scrolls and stuff like that. So these were the Moors that were here in southern Spain, but eventually would be moved out of here, and then we'd have Portugal and Spain. So when we talk about European kingdoms, okay, in space and resources, the Moors being moved out of Spain and Portugal will become very important, because those two countries in the Iberian Peninsula will become two of the most powerful countries as we start to look at transatlantic trade. And that's something we looked at in 1.5 standard.